Hello, everyone, and welcome to a CEU training by TLC Services. We'll say more about us at the end. And our topic today is the Big Five personality model and how it applies to therapy. The Big Five personality model is also known as OCEAN, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And it's an experimentally validated model of personality. I'm Bonnie Hovel, and I have an MSW. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, and I have two big chunks of experience. One was at the VA for 25 years, and the other was in my own consulting work. And during that time, I applied social work principles and skills to organizational behavior, team building, executive coaching, and that sort of thing. So some of my examples will relate more to that than to individual counseling. But I really have a passion for this topic because I've found that assessments are really helpful in leaping forward to quickly identify some of the issues that are helpful when you work with people. The objectives of this training are shown here. One is just understanding how these personality traits, are called the Big Five, how they relate to life satisfaction and health outcomes. And then understanding the pros and cons of using this kind of an assessment in therapy. Reviewing your own results. I hope that most of you were able to take the assessment, but if you weren't, don't worry, we'll have a way of working with that, and you can just kind of listen, make a few notes, and then maybe take it later if you want to. And then we're going to review your assessment results if you have them, and look at that in terms of what you can learn about yourself and how you, what it means to you as a therapist and how you might work with others, and begin to evaluate how you could use it if you decided you wanted to use it in a therapy setting. This is a visual overview of the Big Five personality traits. Now, if you look at it, it spells OCEAN, OCEAN, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and then neuroticism, or you can call it negative emotionality. That's what I'll call it most of the time. They're kind of interchangeable for this purpose. So this is a modern model that's mathematically sound. That's kind of a tongue twister within the limits of testing. And other models like Myers-Briggs that you might be familiar with have less independence, meaning the different traits within it might overlap more and might have less coverage in terms of the full range of things that you can talk about in terms of personality traits. This one gives a really rich description of a personality and helps us understand the complexities and shows strengths and weaknesses. And it gives a thumbnail for quicker access for problem areas and kind of gives you a way to talk with someone about their own personality and how that could be affecting some of their issues. So you can see from this slide that it's been developed for many years, starting in the 1950s. And some theories that they studied back then had many more traits than 5. They had anywhere from 16 to 4,000 traits. But several sets of researchers came up with these same 5 independently. And it's been developed for decades. So these are the 5 broad domains that are considered to be the core or essential traits that define human personality and that account for individual differences. Excuse me. And it's based on how people describe themselves and describe others. It's really remarkably universal over more than 50 cultures. And the scores, especially if you have a very high or very low score, gives insight on why you behave the way you do. So it's highly correlated with, genetics is highly correlated with these Big Five scores. So it's really in our DNA. About half of it comes right from our genetics and it's inheritable. So You will notice that in families, I'm sure, that some people have certain personality traits, and you can say, gee, seems so much like his dad in that situation. And gender does matter too. Women have somewhat higher scores in several areas like agreeableness and warmth, which is part of extroversion, but also in negative emotionality, tuning into negative emotions more. And men come out higher in assertiveness generally and openness to ideas. And that's part of extroversion and part of openness, as you'll see in a minute. And culture affects it also. So the results often correlate with types of local political systems, and where individualism is really valued, as in our culture, then we have higher average extroversion in the population. And if you have a culture where there's a lot of power inequalities, then you might have a little higher average conscientiousness. And birth order does matter too, somewhat. They're still debating that. But what they've found is that the older siblings have a little more emotional stability, and they're more dominant, more conscientious, more agreeable, and lower in negative emotions, but they tend to be less sociable. So that's just one of the examples of things that have been studied, and they're still working on that. It does correlate with standard models of psychiatric disorders. And for example, the DSM-5 is shifting a little closer to the big five with the supplementary 5-domain dimensional model. But some people feel they could go even closer to this through recognizing that there's a bipolarity in a personality structure, including normal traits more and expanding the coverage of dysfunctional personality traits. Also, the MMPI, there are some correlations there. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, some of you have probably worked with that. It has elements that correlate with the big five, such as agreeableness is one of the examples. In the MMPI, they look at cynicism, aggressive hostility, delinquency, and then family attachment, the whole range from functional to dysfunctional. So this is not a psychiatric diagnostic tool, but if it's used, it can help give information that illuminates the strengths and weaknesses, and it can provide a context to better interpret the scales of the MMPI and maybe some of the other psychodiagnostic tools. So what are personality traits? Here's a definition. There are particular tendencies to feel, think, and behave in certain ways, ways that are used to describe the personality of an individual. Now, this second bullet is really important. It's no single trait is right or wrong or good or bad. There are really pluses and minuses no matter where you are on a continuum in any of these traits. And the third bullet, traits that enhance effectiveness in one situation may impair it in another. I just give you an example of that. Someone who's agreeable might do better in a team-based job than someone who is not. But the opposite could be true if the job had more to do with analysis and being carefully methodical. So traits that help you in one may not in another. Overall, I know you all know this. Personalities are complex and variable, and they influence our behaviors. So what do we mean by behavior? Behaviors are interactions between a person's underlying personality and then the situations that the person finds himself in. And maybe a simpler way to say it is they're actions that are observable and measurable, the actions you can see somebody doing. This is a visual overview of the 5 traits. Now here you can see with the red letters, it's spelling ocean. And I'm not going to go over each one of these in detail here, but we are going to go over each one of them in the following slides. But I like this because it shows that each one is a continuum. You're not yes or no. You have openness or you don't. You're somewhere on the continuum. Same with each of the traits. And so everyone falls somewhere in between the complete low and the complete high, although you will see some 100 scores. I haven't seen any zeros yet, but I have seen some 100s. So for example, here in the middle, extroversion, someone who's low on that is quiet, solitary, and reserved. Someone who's high is outgoing, energetic, and gregarious. So that part we all can observe in people. So let's just take each one by one. Openness to experience. Someone who's really open to experience likes abstract concepts and likes to try new things, prefers variety, likes to tackle challenges. All those things are more appealing to someone with high openness. Now, in this assessment that some of you took, I hope many of you took, it showed not just the trait, the overall trait of openness, but also some of the subtraits. And the subtraits for this that it actually measured were intellectual curiosity, creative imagination, and aesthetic sensitivity. I also noticed there were some longer, some that took longer online that you could take that actually had 6 subtraits, but this one has 3 for each of them. The opposite of an extrovert is someone who's more consistent or cautious, not extrovert, I'm sorry, openness to experience. Someone who's not open is more consistent and cautious and likes the tried and true. So I know someone who's 100 out of 100 on this scale. And this person will try anything in terms of food, experiences, likes to go travel everywhere, might even consider bungee jumping, I'm not sure, but would love to study a new theory every week. So this goes to both mental processes and physical ones too. And I think as we look at each of these, you'll probably think of people that you know who are really high or low on them. And I have a really good friend who has a really different personality than I do. And I'm actually fairly high on openness. My score was an 88, but compared to her, I think she's probably quite a bit lower on this, but I haven't asked her to take this because I have a feeling she wouldn't be open to it. So the next one we'll look at, the C in the ocean, conscientiousness. Someone who's really high in this would spend lots of time preparing, finishing tasks right away, making sure to pay attention to detail, would really like a set schedule. And the extreme, it could be kind of a perfectionist in an unhealthy way. And if someone who's really low in this would dislike structure and schedules and might be a little messier person, wouldn't return everything where it goes every time, procrastinates, and fails to complete assigned tasks. So there are the differences in high and low. The subtraits that they measure are when you're really conscientious, you're productive, responsible, organized, and self-disciplined. And then in the opposite, you'd be more extravagant, careless, or you could say carefree. You might choose fun in the moment versus getting all the tasks done that you know need to be done. So I had a coworker who was really quick to add ideas, high openness and really creative, but she was low on this conscientiousness scale. And so I wouldn't rely on her to do carry through, but I would bring her in for the big ideas. So she was great at introducing new ideas. So as you can see, people, especially if you're doing teamwork, you can put the right people together and you get people that are good at different things. So extroversion, someone who's highly extroverted, it's pretty obvious. They enjoy being the center of attention. They're very expressive and willing to share. They like to start conversations. And they like to talk through things while they're trying to solve problems, discussing it out loud. They enjoy meeting new people, usually have a really wide social circle of friends and acquaintances. It's very easy to make friends. They're energized and inspired around other people. But if you're low in this, then you might prefer solitude, like quieter situations, and maybe even become exhausted around other people. It might be more difficult to start conversations, and maybe you don't like small talk very much. This person would think carefully before speaking and dislikes being the center of attention. So the subtraits they measure here are sociable, assertive, and high energy. And then the opposite is introverted, solitary, and reserved. So I am only 54 on this scale. So I'm kind of in the middle, introvert, extrovert. And that was true in Myers-Briggs. I would always be right in the middle. And I know that like several people in our group, thinking of a TLC group, love to get in front of a camera. They're not as shy and might volunteer for things like this, what we're doing today. And they're higher in extroversion than I am. And I think I have extroversion envy, actually. That's one I would like to have those qualities. The next one's agreeableness. So someone who's really agreeable feels empathy and concern for other people. They're really concerned about social harmony, relationship harmony, harmony with others. They enjoy helping and contributing to the happiness of other people and like to assist others who are in need of help. Now, if you're really low in this, then you don't really have that need or drive to care so much about how other people feel, don't take as much interest in others, maybe have more self-interest. Now, on the extreme, it could be maybe even insulting or belittling others, and competitive and manipulative. So that could get negative in the really low end. And the opposite of agreeable is distrustful, challenging, uncooperative, antagonistic. In my career doing team building, this was one of the most important traits that affected teamwork. I found that, well, I had a lot of retreats and people would come as a team, and the people that were more on the agreeable side would be kind of ready to dig in and have a good time and get something done. And then the people who were disagreeable would kind of sit there with their arms folded. Oh, we've done this before. Oh, I don't know why I'm here. I should be doing my work. And so it took a little bit of strategy to figure out how to pull them in, because what I discovered that they had in common with each other, those who were more disagreeable, is they love to share their knowledge and they love to show that they had that knowledge. So I would just pull them in slowly, ask them what they knew, ask them to share what they knew, and involve them in, okay, maybe you can help us troubleshoot what could go wrong and we can make sure it doesn't. So it just takes a different approach. So here, one other example I'd like to give you. It's fun to compare your agreeableness score with somebody else that you know well. So mine is mine is 100. My score in agreeableness is 100, and my husband's is 63. And so my automatic answer to most things is, yes, I'll do that. And his automatic answer to most things is no, or he's really going to think it over before he's ready to jump in there. And this one, now this is the only one of the 5 big personality traits that higher is not really better. You don't want to be very high on the score, but if you are, it just, well, we'll talk about it in detail here. I call it negative emotionality because neurosis, the word neurosis, as you all probably know, is not really in the DSM anymore since about 1980, when they changed to looking more at behaviors instead of underlying conditions. but they still use it in the ICD, the World Health Organization International Class of Disorders. And it just refers to the defense mechanisms that produce, the ones that produce difficulties in your life are called neuroses. And there's a whole range of these, of course, even among normally functioning individuals. So that's what's being measured here in this assessment. And a person who's really high in negative emotionality interprets ordinary situations as threatening. Something that's just a little bit bad to one person might be really threatening to another. And you know, it's not just in the mind either. When they do skin conductance tests to determine if someone's really stressed, they turn out a lot higher in these individuals. So the person who's high in this might have an idealized self-image and try to measure up. And it makes it kind of hard to think clearly if they're constantly going over in their mind how they're not measuring up or if they're stressed a lot. And if a person's low in this, then it's the opposite of that. It's more like self-realization. There's a full depth of spontaneous feelings, but it's not really anxiety driven. So the subtraits that are measured in this one are if someone might be anxious, depressed, or emotionally volatile. And they kind of can tease out which ones are which. So you could actually see in your scores or in your diagram which areas would be higher or lower. And the opposite is more optimistic, emotionally stable, and satisfied. Well, we all know people who are more calming to be around, and they're probably really low in this, and others who are more keyed up or more nervous. And sometimes those who are more excitable like that are also more exciting to be around. They're not as steady or maybe not as boring. So it just depends on how far along the continuum they might be. I thought it would be fun to take a look at a profile of the most difficult personality type. And here it is. So this person would have high negative emotionality. So he is suffering more with anxiety, maybe self-consciousness, depression, and more sensitive to stress. High in openness, and that would give him sort of a difficulty in relating to the majority of people, doesn't want any small talk, wants a lot of variety, bored easily. So if he's high on both openness and emotionality, then he would seek and desire change, but then that would cause anxiety and emotional pain. So one way that they put this is they seek to saw off the branch on which they're sitting. It's kind of a vicious cycle. And if they're low in agreeableness along with this, then they might be really blunt and straight to the point. They could be competitive, and that leads to more disagreements and conflicts. And so that friction in turn causes distress again. And then if you're low in extroversion, besides all that, you'd be seeking solitude. And then your negative emotions could be amplified because you're all alone with them. And then the high in conscientiousness part would make you take work really seriously and be kind of uptight. And low in agreeableness, hard to deal with. You might expect others to measure up and be kind of harsh with them. So this last sentence here kind of describes this person. Blunt, uncompassionate, unconventional, maybe unfriendly, selfish, competitive, conflicted, less sociable, more easily stressed, anxious, and possibly depressed. But the catch here is too, they could also be a great achiever, because this kind of describes the personality of some of the really famous people who were artists or good at some other field like that. It doesn't mean that they're somebody who can't have a good outcome in some ways in their lives. Has anyone, I think we've all had a client or a friend, maybe not with every one of these, but with, say, 4 out of the 5, making them a challenge to work with. So in all of this, it's good to remember that this isn't giving a personality type. It's it's saying what propensities someone has. So it's not placing someone in a quadrant or trying to describe their type of person. And it allows you to compare yourself to others. If you got the assessment, you would see a comparison, and we'll look at a chart in a minute. We can talk about that better. So you can compare yourself to other Americans, basically. And then you can look at subtraits, which can be a little more informative. What are some of the things that affect these traits? Well, first of all, the studies for the last few decades have shown that nature and nurture are about 50-50 in terms of feeding into this and what creates a personality. And both genetic inheritance and family life and environment. And shy children are more likely to become introverted adults. It develops pretty early in life. And culture, what are your values and beliefs, including whether you can tolerate differences or whether you're intolerant of differences? Those things are can be culturally passed down through the generations. 4 of these 5 traits are relatively stable from childhood through adulthood. Agreeableness is the only one that's not included there. But that doesn't mean they're set in stone. New experiences, education, and therapy all can help people cope better. And with these awarenesses, it might be helpful for them to see kind of what they're coping with. Also, growing older tends to make people less extroverted, have less negative emotionality, and be less open to experience. So those 3 things kind of happen over time with people. Disease also alters our traits. And one of the easiest to see examples of that would be Alzheimer's disease. That results in a decrease in conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, and an increase in negative emotionality. And that's partly what explains how people feel when they're with a loved one with Alzheimer's, and eventually they feel that person is not the same person anymore. The personality is actually changing. And then another thing to keep in mind is mood can affect how your scores come out when you're taking this assessment. Because, for example, if you have an argument with a spouse right before you do it, your agreeableness might not come out quite as high. So, how do the big 5 traits relate to life satisfaction and health outcomes? There are some correlations, and both positive and negative, that I just wanted to point out. Subjective well being, like how do you feel about how well you're doing? If you're more extroverted, then you're going to feel better about how you're doing. If you have higher negative emotionality, you're going to feel worse about how you're doing. And you can probably just think about people you know and um, realize that that's really true, because a lot of it has to do with your attitude and how you feel and whether you're having a good social experience in the case of extroversion. Now, spirituality, um, now this takes into account spirituality and religion and everything. If you're higher in conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness, and lower in negative emotionality, then spirituality is either a big factor in your life or you might seek it out. And with just religiousness, if you were looking at that separately, agreeableness is the thing that's correlated with that. And then health and well being, both physical and mental health, are improved or correlated with conscientiousness, lower negative emotionality, and higher agreeableness. And that's probably because, with the conscientiousness part, it's probably because people make better choices towards their health. And these are good things for therapists to realize when they're working with someone, um, because they can help a person, even if conscientiousness doesn't come natural to somebody. they might be able to help them reframe what they have control over in a way that the person could improve their health outcomes. And then higher negative emotionality is correlated with all of these things: moodiness, anxiety, worry, fear, anger, frustration, all of these more negative emotions, depressed mood, and loneliness. And these are some functions and dysfunctions that are predicted by the big five traits. High negative emotionality leads to overall dysfunction and also a higher degree of mental disorder. High extroversion predicts good social and recreational function. High openness predicts good recreational function. High agreeableness predicts good social function. And high conscientiousness predicts good work function. Now, this is a visual representation of the assessment and what it came out with in the 5 different traits. Now, this one is an example from my husband, the one my husband took. And so it shows a pentagon, and each corner has one of the 5 traits. And so it's a little bit weird looking because it's 2-dimensional and we're measuring a lot of things here. But it shows you how you can look at it, and then you can look at the national average and see what areas you might be lower in. So for example, negative emotionality, his is right there in the middle. It's pretty similar to the population, actually, from what I can tell here. And conscientiousness, then his comes down out farther to the edge, which means he has higher conscientiousness there, and so forth. So your scores on that one page are really helpful when you're going through this, trying to learn about it. And here's one of the sub-traits. Now, I took this from my own. This is my extroversion score. As I told you, I had extroversion envy. So I am like not even to the 75th percentile there under sociability. My energy level's a little higher. It's at the 75. But my assertiveness, as you can see, is clear down there in the 25. So that's how I came up with, oh, okay, well, my lowest area is assertiveness. That's where I could probably have the most improvement in my experiences if I could realize when I'm not being assertive. Okay, so how do you work with your own traits and learn from them? So I'm using myself here as an example again. And I'm saying with extroversion, so I'm moderate in that, but I'm only at 54. So when they gave me my results, they said it was moderate. But I have lower assertiveness. So as a therapist, I have to ask myself, what are my boundaries? Am I paying attention to that, or am I really trying to please this person and meet this person's needs and not consider enough about my own? So that's one point. Then agreeableness, I'm so high, I'm 100%. So am I trying to meet other people's needs? Am I too flexible in scheduling others, for example? And if I combine that with lower assertiveness, that could show a little bigger problem. And then negative emotionality, I'm low in that. So you might think, whoa, that's wonderful. I don't feel stressed that much, and I get through things and I'm pretty calm. However, I may not easily understand those with higher negative emotionality. So it's important for me to realize that they're not wired the same way as I am. And I can stop and think, what I do really is I kick in with more compassion. I think to myself, wow, that must be really hard to deal with those negative emotions. And so my compassion can kick in and help me through that. So let's take a look at your results. And I want to give about 4 minutes here for you to just look at your own results and see if you can do what I just did with mine. And so you look at your overall score, And then, so each of the 5 traits has a graphic and a narrative description. And here they are in front of you, the openness, conscientiousness, right there listed. And then look at the score on the continuum. Are you high? Are you low? Are you moderate? And I would suggest you take one high and one low and just think about it for a minute and say, what does that mean for me in my style as a therapist? And just jot a couple notes. Um, Later, when you have a breakout session, it will be helpful to you to have that with you. Okay, I hope that gave you enough time to jot a few notes. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking it's good to think about, are you an organized therapist and structured? What is your style? Like if you have high conscientiousness, you might be more organized and structured. Or are you more creative in what you suggest for people, for clients? Or do you stick more to the tried and true? And that might be higher in openness or lower in openness. And another thing is, do you become stressed if your clients are unorganized and not doing planned things that you hoped for them and not following through? And that kind of would go with whether you were higher in negative emotionality, or are you calm and collected no matter what? And that would probably be true if you're lower in negative emotionality. So I had a client once who was really high on negative emotionality and really low on conscientiousness. And so I'm the opposite for both. So I kept thinking of things he could do for himself. This was before I knew about this assessment. I kept thinking of things that he could do to follow through during the week. And when this didn't happen, he would say, oh, it's too stressful. I can't do X or I can't do Y because it really stresses me out. And so I can't do that. And so it finally came to the idea that it really was not helpful to try and get him to do anything in between sessions because it just stressed both me and him. And so what I did was we increased the number of sessions and we just did the work in the sessions. I just helped him through all the work that we were doing, and I didn't send him out with anything to do. And it was really much more beneficial with that particular client. So this is a visual representation of how I see. It's kind of a model of what I see happens in therapy if you're doing a kind of integrative therapy, and this is sort of more of a long-term over time. And it could be used with any model, but it's just to show that the first part of it is the analysis. So there are presenting symptoms and there's a situation that the person is presenting. And then those things are kind of examined through talking or whatever means, figuring out what needs intervention, trying to figure out the highest priorities. And so you go through a discovery and evaluation of all the factors that are involved. And so the Big Five assessment is just one way of examining the personality and seeing how the person could address his issues and knowing his strengths and knowing the weaknesses and then coming up with strategies. So in where these colored circles are is like the factors you're addressing. And there's more than personality, of course. There's things like the social environment, there's relationship issues, there's other things going on. But this is a way of saying, okay, knowing who you are, how can you best address things? And so the healing happens as you go through the increase the person's resilience through taking a look at what resources he has that he can draw on and promoting the healing in all the different ways. So I see this as just one way of identifying and addressing the factors before you pull it all back together. And having a common language to speak with the client. So there are pros and cons. I think that the benefits are that it helps the therapist identify her own blind spots and then giving a thumbnail for quicker access to problem areas and how to talk to the person about coping with their issues. And it gives you some clues, and then you can confirm those clues. And it's less exhaustive than some of the other things like the MMPI, and it's not really used for diagnosis anyway. But what is a disadvantage? Some of the disadvantages are that it could be considered kind of superficial because it's based on self-reporting. So you need to prep the client to give as honest as possible answers when they're filling it out. Otherwise, it's not that helpful. And it could look like you're trying to stereotype the client. So my suggestion is the best way to do it is you wait a while, you develop a rapport, and then if you think this person could really benefit, then you point out how it might help and enlist their agreement that we'll be partners in this. And then be sure you're using it as just one piece of information and not everything. So we're going to do a breakout group and just see if we can address a particular client and how we might work with that client. And I'm going to ask Lou to unmute so we can talk to each other here. But what I'd like you to do is first, when you're in your group, you're going to be in a group of about 3 or 4 people. And first, choose somebody as a spokesperson so that when you're finished, that person can tell the rest of the larger group kind of a few of the highlights that you came up with. And so consider this situation. You have a client with a presenting issue of conflict with a close friend over how much socializing should be done right now during the pandemic as things open up more. So you've done the big 5 with this client, and the scores are high in extroversion, low conscientiousness, and fairly high in negative emotionality. None of the other scores are really telling you much, they're moderate. So talk about how you might work with her and how your own personal traits might come into play. So if you made a few notes earlier about your own traits, then that might be useful while you're doing this. All right, this has been brought to you by TLC Services. And for those who might not know, we're a volunteer organization of around 22, or is it 24, Pat? We always ask her. 22
24.
or 24 retired mental health professionals. We have social workers, counselors, family therapists, all sorts of mental health counselors. And we do these things: training, support groups, presentations, and one-on-one counseling. We have a great website which lists all our events. And I'm going to also mention a few upcoming events.